At 0742 on a frigid January morning in 1944, a de Havilland Mosquito flew solo above northern Germany, its thin gray shape slicing through the icy air. Below, at 28,000 feet, a blanket of broken clouds concealed a landscape dotted with flak batteries, airfields and cities that had been burning intermittently for 4 years. Inside the wooden aircraft, Flight Lieutenant Edward Hayes observed a tiny speck rise from a German airfield far behind his left wing and begin to climb in pursuit. At just 23 years old, with 36 operational sorties under his belt and 0 victories, he had been explicitly instructed on several occasions to avoid combat at all costs. The Mosquito's Merlin engines hummed steadily at high altitude, the propellers cutting through the thin air. It was a reconnaissance model, its bomb bay filled with cameras rather than explosives. With an unarmed nose and a fuselage painted in pale camouflage to blend with the sky and clouds, the aircraft was officially not a fighter and was never intended to engage in combat. Despite this, the speck behind him continued to grow larger. Hayes slightly banked the Mosquito, enough to catch a glimpse of the tail in his mirror. There, he saw the unmistakable knife-like profile of a Messerschmitt Bf-109 climbing through the scattered clouds, nose angled ahead of the Mosquito's wake, using bursts of emergency power. The German fighter's wings briefly flashed as it crossed a patch of winter sunlight. The navigator, secured beside him under the canopy, tapped his gloved finger on the fuel gauge and then on the camera control box. With 200 miles of hostile airspace remaining before the North Sea, the Mosquito's belly contained canisters of exposed photographic film, holding valuable intelligence that Bomber Command would use in the coming days. Orders for these missions were clear: climb higher if enemy fighters appear, turn away, use speed, and do not engage in combat. The Mosquito's job was to observe and survive, not to fight. Hayes could have pushed the throttles forward and made a gradual climbing turn to the west, reducing his profile and trusting in the Mosquito's speed to outlast the German fighter. It was the safe manual solution, but as he watched the 109 climb toward him, he saw that it was coming up steep, nearly straight at his tail, with its energy slowly draining. The Mosquito, slightly heavier due to fuel and cameras but still faster in level flight, was positioned above the German's ideal interception point. Every foot the German gained was paid for in lost airspeed. The Mosquito had 2 advantages the German did not: altitude and speed. For 6 months, Hayes had been told these advantages were only for escape, to be used as shields, not weapons. Now, high over winter Germany, as a single fighter struggled to reach him, Hayes felt a shift in understanding. Altitude was energy, and energy could be used even to strike. He gently pushed the nose forward, just enough to feel the Merlin's pickup. The airspeed needle crept higher, and the distance between the Mosquito and the Messerschmitt shortened. The next decision would violate standing orders, risk a court-martial, and determine whether the aircraft, its crew, and their vital intelligence would make it back to England. To understand how he reached this moment bending, a reconnaissance aircraft into an intercept against one of the PF-Ensigns aircraft into an intercept and to an intercept against one of the PF. Luftwaffe's best fighters, it's necessary to go back 2 years to a different sky and a different kind of speed. By early 1942, the Royal Air Force had a new tool, the de Havilland Mosquito, and little knowledge of how to protect it. Built largely of wood in an era of metal shortages, it flew faster than most fighters on either side. Lacking armor or power-operated turrets, it relied on speed and altitude, not guns or thick skin. The reconnaissance variants of the Mosquito were among the most valuable assets in the British arsenal, providing detailed photographs of German regions. These included images of U-boat pens, V-weapon sites in northern France, and synthetic oil plants in the Ruhr, Every image contributed to target folders for Bomber Command, routing night raids and refining naval convoy operations. Losing a Mosquito aircraft itself had little cost, but losing its crew, their experience, and the valuable film meant a huge setback in intelligence. Fighter sweeps could be replaced, but reconnaissance aircraft and their crews could not. Thus, strict orders were issued to keep the Mosquito out of combat. "Do not engage," the orders stated. "Maintain altitude at all costs and turn away from enemy fighters." In briefings from Benson to satellite fields, intelligence officers pointed to charts showing interception altitudes and ranges, reassuring that the Mosquito could outrun and outclimb almost anything if trouble was spotted early. But reality was more complex. German controllers learned the patterns of British reconnaissance flights, and radar tracked high-flying intruders. Pairs and squadrons of Bf-109s and FW-19OS waited on alert strips to intercept them. Mosquitoes over coastal beacons prompted fighters to scramble in climbing turns, intercepting the British aircraft well inland. Some Mosquito crews never saw their attackers, just a sudden burst of cannon fire from below or ahead. A wing would shear off, a fuel tank ignited, and a wooden aircraft would become a cloud of splinters over forests and fields. The odds were grim. Months of training went into creating a skilled reconnaissance crew, yet one well-timed pass from an experienced German pilot could erase them. Command responded with the same orders: avoid combat, trust speed, and stay high. When Flight Lieutenant Edward Hayes joined his squadron in late 1942, this doctrine was as established as the runways of the airfield. He had grown up far from runways on the flat, windswept coast of Norfolk. His world was not filled with metal and fuel, but with salt, wind, and the persistent pull of the tides. His father, a boat builder in a small yard near Wells next the sea, shaped hulls from timber, sealed seams with tar, and taught his eldest son that water and air obeyed the same quiet rules. The North Sea shaped everything. In winter, gray rollers rolled in beneath a low sky, crashing on sandbanks and leaving lines of foam etched in the beach. In summer, the wind was steady and clean over the marshes. Local boys, like Hayes, learned to read it the way farmers read their fields. Some did it by instinct. Others, like Hayes, did it almost mathematically. At 14, he learned to sail a clinker-built dinghy his father had repaired from a wreck. The boat was heavy and reluctant in light winds, quick to bury its nose if mishandled in a gust. Sailing it fast meant understanding that speed wasn't created from nothing. It was borrowed from wind, height, and angles. As he grew older, he raced the same boat against lighter, faster craft from better-funded clubs. He rarely won the start. The more polished crews accelerated faster off the line, their sails trimmed quickly. But the boy who had grown up by the marsh noticed something none of the others did. The tide in the estuary didn't move as one smooth sheet, but as a shifting pattern of faster streams and slower back eddies. Deeper channels between sandbanks carried water out faster, while shallow shelves slowed it. A boat sailing down a fairway with the wind over its quarter could gain or lose lengths depending on the path the helmsman chose. On calm evenings, Hayes would drift at slack water, watching leaves and foam on the surface. They moved at different speeds depending on their location. He memorized where the currents pressed hardest, where they slackened, and where two streams met. The next races were different. He stopped trying to race boat for boat up the same water as everyone else. Instead, he steered longer, curving lines that crossed invisible boundaries of current and depth. Sometimes this meant sailing further, but through faster water. Sometimes it meant holding a seemingly wasteful angle to the wind, trading pure speed for a position that would pay off 5 minutes later when the tide bent. He watched other boats surge ahead at first, but then find themselves struggling against an unseen river. His own heavier dinghy, driven along the sharp edge of faster channels, would creep up on them from unexpected angles. Races weren't won in frantic bursts of speed, but in the quiet accumulation of small advantages built from invisible energy. When war came and the call went out for pilots, he joined the Royal Air Force as soon as he was old enough. His training started on Tiger Moths, then progressed to heavier, faster machines. Instructors quickly noticed the same skill that had let him nurse his awkward boat into favorable winds. He treated altitude and speed the way he treated tide and wind-like resources to be managed, spent with care and turned into position rather than panic. He first flew Blenheims, then twin-engine trainers, and finally transitioned onto the Mosquito, an aircraft that seemed closest in spirit to the fast, sharp racing dinghies of his youth. Built of wood, demanding and unforgiving if mishandled, but rewarding if flown with respect for invisible currents. By the time he reached his reconnaissance unit, attrition had already taken a toll on the squadron. Names had been written on the dispersal boards only to be rubbed out. The mess tables felt half empty. The veterans spoke softly of aircraft that had simply never returned from deep penetrations into Germany high, fast and supposedly safe, yet still caught by fighters that came out of the clouds like thrown knives. Briefing officers repeated the same doctrine: avoid combat, climb away, trust the Mosquito's speed. Hayes accepted the words, but the winds and tides of his youth had taught him something that the doctrine didn't mention. A current that always ran in one direction could be predicted and exploited. Enemy fighters climbed from known airfields along known altitudes, with controllers on the ground vectoring them onto lines that intersected his paths. There was a geometry to it. On his first sorties into enemy territory, Hayes followed the manual's instructions. In February 1943, during a winter mission over the Ruhr, the Mosquito climbed to operational altitude and settled into cruise, its engines leaned for range. The target was a chemical plant near Leverkusen, its chimneys and rail sidings already known, but in need of updated images. The sky above the industrial region was filled with contrails as German fighters spiraled below bomber routes, scratching the thin white lines. A pair of Bf-109s surged into Hayes' altitude band. The navigator calmly called them out by clock position. Hayes did as instructed, keeping his turn shallow, maintaining speed, and edging away toward the coastline. The Messerschmitts climbed through the Mosquito's contrail level, fell back, and then broke away. The doctrine had worked that time, but as they left the region, flak burst drifted lazily up, guided by radar. The Mosquito's speed saved it, but not without damage. Jagged splinters scarred its tailplane, and a thin trickle of fuel leaked from a punctured line. Another narrow escape. Another sortie spent as prey. Back at base, reports were filed. Controllers marked interception points, and intelligence officers drew thin red lines on wall maps. The pattern was becoming both more complex and more predictable. German radar scanned from the coast inward when a lone, high-flying intruder appeared. Phones rang, scramble bells blared louder, and fighters launched not from everywhere, but from airfields strategically positioned around industrial regions and major cities. The climbs followed a familiar pattern: steep, power-hungry ascents. As the British aircraft closed the range, the German fighters would break off into shallow pursuits after topping out. For months, Hayes studied the routes as meticulously as he had once studied the tide lines. When he wasn't flying, he sat in the operations room, tracing both successful missions and those that ended in silence. He examined where losses clustered, the altitude bands favored by fighters, and how long they could sustain climbs. Slowly, the uncomfortable truth emerged. At the heights where Mosquitoes operated, German fighters could not afford to wait. The air was thin and engines overheated after long climbs at full power. German pilots would push their machines up steep ascent lines that drained their speed. They reached near Mosquito altitude with energy spent, forced either to dive away or make a desperate brief gun pass before falling back. Doctrine demanded that British crews avoid this intersection. Yet the pilots who handed Hayes their flight logs and combat reports described the same situation repeatedly. When fighters came from below, climbing hard, there was a moment, brief and almost subliminal, where the Mosquito sat above the German fighter's nose, holding more speed, more potential energy, everything that mattered in a three-dimensional fight. The manuals told them to treat this moment as a warning to flee. Hayes began to wonder if it could be something else. The idea didn't come to him as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual accumulation of data. He knew his aircraft's true airspeed at various altitudes. He knew from intelligence reports the climb rates and ceilings of German fighters. He understood the standard vectoring calls used by German controllers gleaned from intercepted radio traffic. He began to sketch climb profiles and crossing tracks in the margins of his logbook and on scrap paper in the crew room. These sketches weren't of traditional dogfights but curves of energy. What if, instead of simply fleeing when fighters appeared, a Mosquito used its altitude advantage to dive not away, but across the German fighter's line, turning potential energy into speed and position, and spending that speed in a precise, single-firing pass from above and ahead? It sounded like madness, even in his own mind. After all, the reconnaissance Mosquito had no guns to use, even if it managed such an intercept. Installing weapons meant adding weight, changing the camera layout, and increasing maintenance demands. But the airframes existed. Fighter-bomber Mosquitoes already flew low-level strikes, their noses armed with machine guns and cannons. Intruder variants hunted enemy aircraft at night. The basic structure was the same. The idea that slowly formed in Hayes's mind was not to turn every reconnaissance aircraft into a fighter, but to apply the logic of speed and altitude in a new way, transforming pure avoidance into conditional aggression, treating those advantages as something that could be aimed in time and space. The moment of discovery didn't come in a lecture hall or briefing room, but at dusk in the shadow of a camouflaged hangar, with the smell of hot oil and fabric dope hanging in the air. A fighter-bomber squadron shared the same station for a brief period, its Mosquitoes sitting heavier on their wheels, gun ports dark against the lighter paint. Ground crews swapped rumors and tools. Pilots swapped coffee, cigarettes, and stories. One night after a maintenance test, Hayes watched a cannon-armed Mosquito perform a series of climbing and diving turns overhead. Its engines roared as it climbed at full throttle, then dropped to a lower, urgent note as it rolled over the top, spilling height into speed. The pattern clicked. Altitude wasn't just a passive shield. It was stored motion. The Mosquito's speed wasn't just for escape, it was a sharp edge that could be directed. Hayes didn't approach his commanding officer with a fury. He knew how far doctrine could bend before it snapped. Instead, he asked practical questions during engineering briefings. Could a limited number of reconnaissance aircraft be equipped with forward-firing armament without compromising their camera installations? Could these gun-sighted variants lead certain missions, occupying a middle role between pure reconnaissance and pure fighter? After weeks of trial and error, the answer came back. A handful of modified aircraft were ready. They carried both cameras and guns, with their lacquered wooden noses now extended to accommodate cannon barrels and machine gun muzzles. Officially, they remained reconnaissance platforms with their primary task unchanged. Unofficially, pilots like Hayes saw them as the embodiment of a new possibility. The first test didn't come in an exercise. It came in cold, dangerous air above an enemy coast. Hayes had grown accustomed to seeing wooden intruders as prey, not predators. But on that January morning over northern Germany, when the Messerschmitt left its airfield and began climbing towards an intercept course. Hayes knew more than he did during those early missions. Over months, he had observed how German fighters were vectored. He knew that this particular base, located inland from the coast, often launched single aircraft or pairs against lone intruders rather than sending out larger formations. He knew how long the German fighter could sustain its steep climb before heat and drag robbed it of speed. The Mosquito Hayes was flying that day carried 4 20mm cannons in its belly and 4 303 machine guns in its nose. Although the added weight slightly reduced its performance, it still held an advantage at altitude. Cameras still filled the bay, angled downward through crystal clear windows, snapping photos as the aircraft crossed its assigned targets. For the first few seconds after spotting the climbing speck, Hayes instinctively followed the doctrine: a gentle deviation, a slight increase in power, the familiar reflex to stretch the range. But the Messerschmitt continued its pursuit, climbing higher into thinner air. Its pilot was committed to the intercept. There came a point beyond which the German pilot could not easily break off too steep, too slow, and too close to the Mosquito's altitude. Hayes pushed both throttles fully forward, feeling the Merlin engine surge as the superchargers whined, digging into the thin oxygen. The Mosquito's nose dipped slightly, airspeed building. The aircraft no longer eased away in a shallow turn. Instead, it curved out and down, tracing a shallow arc that cut across the German's climb path rather than away from it. The navigator's eyes flicked between the altimeter, the airspeed indicator, and the growing shape of the German fighter below and behind. The Mosquito's wings trembled faintly under the added load as the horizon swung with the aircraft's roll. The geometry had shifted. The Messerschmitt's nose was no longer pointed directly at the Mosquito's tail, but the fighter's tracks were converging. Time compressed. In those seconds, the Mosquito became like the sailing dinghy, threading a narrow, fast current while the heavier boats flailed in slower water. It was all about when and where energy was spent. Hayes used the last few hundred feet of altitude like a final push of tide. He rolled through a bank turn that brought the Mosquito down and ahead of the German fighter, gently pulling the gun side ring toward the point he knew the 109 would have to pass through to fire. The Messerschmitt's pilot, locked into his steep climb, saw the British aircraft's movement too late. To roll and dive away would risk stalling at the top of his climb, hanging in the air like a thrown stone. To keep coming meant flying into the intersection of their paths, while distant flak bursts puffed in the sky mere spectators. The cold air outside the cockpit screamed past the wooden skin. Inside, all the crew could hear was the deep, rising roar of the Merlin engine and the rattle of loose equipment as G-forces nudged everything downward. At the planned crossing point, the Mosquito was moving considerably faster than the 109, its dive shallow, but effective, its energy line arcing across the German fighter's nose. Hayes didn't try to track the fighter through the entire deflection curve. Instead, he aimed at a fixed volume of sky, a fraction ahead of the 109's projected path, and held his fire until the silhouette swelled into that space. When he squeezed the trigger, the Mosquito shuddered as all 8 guns erupted together. Flames spilled from the nose. Empty brass casings hammered against the collection chutes. The tracers crossed the invisible junction where the climb met the dive, and the Messerschmitt flew into it. Cannon shells hammered into the 109's engine, cowling, and cockpit. Panels blew outward, and a trail of smoke and vapor followed. The fighter rolled abruptly, stalled at the top of its climb, and then fell into a tumbling spiral, disappearing into the cloud layer below. No parachute appeared. The Mosquito leveled out, speed still high, wings humming with stress. The navigator made a brief mark on the map, noting time and position no celebration. The cameras continued clicking, collecting the images they had come for, Officially, the combat didn't exist until after landing. Officially, they had been attacked and had simply defended themselves. Unofficially, for the first time, a German fighter had been destroyed by a reconnaissance Mosquito that had chosen to engage rather than flee. Back at base, the debriefing officer listened impassively as the crew described what they had done. The gun camera film was played, and the dark shape of the 109 grew, crossed the frame, and blossomed into fire. Questions followed. Why had they dived instead of continuing to evade? Why had they not stayed high and trusted their speed? The answers didn't fit neatly into doctrine. They were about angles, energy, and an understanding of how long a climbing fighter could survive at high altitudes. They were about seizing a single opportunity created not by recklessness, but by deliberately inverting the logic of escape. The report went up through the channels. Some saw it as an anomaly, a risky improvisation. But others, studying the growing losses among reconnaissance crews, saw in it a potential tool. Over the following months, the idea spread not as a grand tactical revolution, but as a quiet shift in how some crews thought about their aircraft. A handful of reconnaissance Mosquito squadrons received gun-armed variants. At first, they were used cautiously. Doctrine still demanded avoidance and emphasized the value of film over fleeting kills. But within that framework, something had begun to change.